You know that feeling when you fall hard for someone, and they seem perfect at first? The mysterious stranger with the cool aesthetic, the rugged charm, the promise of freedom and adventure. You build them up in your head, romanticize every little thing about them, tell all your friends how amazing they are. Then one day you wake up and realize you've been dating someone who rarely bathes, has a drinking problem, and whose idea of conflict resolution involves firearms. That's basically America's relationship with cowboys. We spent over a century swooning over an image we created in our heads, completely ignoring the fact that the real thing was often unwashed, violent, and honestly kind of sad. This video is about how America manufactured its most iconic hero from the absolute messiest raw materials imaginable, sold that fantasy to the world, and then had to live with the consequences of making terrible life choices our national identity. Picture this. It's 1865, and you're standing in the wreckage of post-Civil War America. The country just spent 4 years tearing itself apart. Over 600,000 people are dead. The South is literally burning, and everyone's trying to figure out what comes next. The nation needs something, anything, to feel good about. Enter the cowboy, stage right, covered in dust and cow manure. Now here's the thing nobody tells you about actual cowboys. They were mostly broke young men doing one of the worst jobs in 19th century America. We're talking about guys who spent months at a time pushing cattle across empty plains, sleeping on the ground, eating beans that would give you digestive issues that could clear a saloon, and getting paid about $1 a day if they were lucky. The average cowboy was in his early 20s, often illiterate, and had a life expectancy that made being a medieval peasant look appealing. They weren't rugged individualists living free. They were employees of big cattle companies, doing backbreaking labor in conditions that would violate about 17 modern workplace safety regulations. But America in the 1860s and 1870s desperately needed heroes, and it definitely didn't want heroes who reminded people of the actual nightmare the country had just lived through. So writers and showmen looked west and saw these cattle herders and thought, you know what? We can work with this. We can turn this into something, and thus began the greatest rebranding campaign in American history. Dime novels started pumping out cowboy stories like a content farm on steroids. Suddenly, cowboys weren't underpaid ranch hands. They were noble frontiersmen. They weren't sleeping in their own filth for weeks. They were living free under the stars. They weren't often scared kids far from home. They were fearless gunfighters who always shot straight and never missed. Writers like Ned Buntline created characters like Buffalo Bill, taking a real person who was basically a glorified tour guide and hunting enthusiast, and transforming him into a legend. The actual William Cody was decent at his job, sure, but the literary Buffalo Bill could outshoot anyone, outwit any villain, and presumably never had to deal with saddle sores or dysentery. Then Buffalo Bill himself saw the opportunity and ran with it. In 1883, he launched Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, and this is where the cowboy myth went from regional tall tale to international phenomenon. Cody's show was part circus, part historical reenactment, part complete fabrication, and it was a massive hit. He had real cowboys, actual Native Americans, sharpshooters like Annie Oakley, and dramatic recreations of events that either never happened or happened very differently than portrayed. The show toured America and Europe, and suddenly everyone from London to Paris was obsessed with American cowboys. European aristocrats who had never been west of Philadelphia were now experts on frontier life based on watching a 2-hour stage show. The Wild West show told audiences that the frontier was a place where good guys wore white hats, bad guys wore black hats, and everything got resolved with a fair gunfight at high noon. Never mind that most actual frontier violence was random, meaningless, and usually involved someone getting shot in the back. Wait. Stop here for a second. I need to ask you something real. Have you ever built up an idea of something so much in your head that when you finally experienced the real thing, it felt like a betrayal? Like you invested so much emotion into the fantasy that facing reality actually hurt? If you felt that, if this hit close to home, drop a comment right now. Just write, I felt this. That's it. Because when you do that, you're not just commenting, you're telling someone else scrolling through that they're not alone in that weird disappointment we all carry when our fantasies crash into facts. Your words matter more than you think. Now here's where it gets really interesting. While Buffalo Bill was touring Europe, actual cowboy life in America was already basically over. The open range was being fenced off. Railroads were replacing cattle drives, and most of the West was settling into boring agricultural routine. But Americans didn't want to hear that. They wanted the myth. They needed the myth. So as the real thing died, the fantasy version got stronger. By the 1890s, artists like Frederick Remington were painting cowboys as these bronze gods of the plains, all muscle and nobility, completely ignoring the fact that he was painting a job that barely existed anymore. Remington's Cowboys looked like they belonged in a Renaissance painting, not shoveling manure behind a barn. His work sold like crazy because it told Americans what they wanted to believe about themselves, that they were tough, independent, and had conquered the wilderness through sheer grit and moral superiority. Then came the movies, and oh boy, did movies love cowboys. The first real Western film hit theaters in 1903, The Great Train Robbery, and it established pretty much every cowboy movie trope you've ever seen. The genre exploded. Silent film cowboys like Tom Mix and William S. Hart became massive stars, and they took the myth even further from reality. Movie cowboys were always heroic, always moral, always knew exactly what to do. They never struggled with moral ambiguity or economic hardship, or any of the actual problems real people faced. They certainly never dealt with the fact that a huge percentage of real cowboys were black or Mexican, because early Hollywood had some pretty specific ideas about what heroes should look like, and those ideas were extremely white. The Western movie industry basically whitewashed the West, while simultaneously making it more mythical. By the 1920s and 1930s, you had stars like Gene Autry and Roy Rogers who were singing cowboys, because apparently the myth needed more embellishment. Nothing says authentic frontier experience like breaking into a musical number while herding cattle. John Wayne arrived in the 1930s and became the physical embodiment of everything America wanted to believe about cowboys and itself. He was tall, tough, drawled his words, and represented a kind of uncomplicated masculinity that appealed to a nation going through the Depression and then World War II. Never mind that Wayne himself avoided military service and spent the war making movies. Never mind that his cowboy persona was as manufactured as a plastic action figure. He represented an America that was strong, knew right from wrong, and solved its problems with direct action. His movies sold a vision of the West where American expansion was noble and necessary, where violence was regrettable but justified, and where real men didn't need to examine their feelings or question their choices. It was comfort food for the national psyche, and audiences ate it up. The 1950s and 1960s were peak cowboy madness. Television gave us shows like Gunsmoke, Bonanza, Rawhide, The Rifleman, and about 50 others. At one point, there were over 30 Western shows on television. Kids across America were growing up on a steady diet of cowboy mythology, playing cowboys and Indians in their backyards, which, yes, that name and that game have some serious problems we're not going to unpack right now. But you get the point. The cowboy had become America's founding myth, its core identity. Politicians started using cowboy imagery to sell themselves. Products used cowboys to sell everything from cigarettes to cars. The Marlboro Man became one of the most successful advertising campaigns in history by associating cigarettes with rugged cowboy masculinity, which is darkly ironic considering several of the men who played the Marlboro Man died of smoking-related diseases. But that's capitalism for you. But here's the thing about building your national identity on a myth. Eventually, reality comes knocking. The 1960s started asking uncomfortable questions about everything, including the cowboy myth. Historians began pointing out that the Old West wasn't quite how Hollywood portrayed it, that the frontier experience involved a lot of suffering, that Native Americans might have a different perspective on Western expansion, that maybe glorifying gun violence wasn't the healthiest national pastime. Movies started getting darker and more complex. By the 1970s and 1980s, you had revisionist westerns that showed cowboys as violent, morally compromised, or just plain mean. Clint Eastwood's characters in films like Unforgiven showed cowboys as broken men haunted by violence, not heroes celebrating it. Modern America is stuck in this weird relationship with the cowboy myth. We know it's not real. We know actual frontier life was nothing like the movies. We know the whole thing is built on some pretty problematic ideas about expansion, violence, and who counts as American. But we can't quite let it go. Country music still sells the cowboy aesthetic. Politicians still wear cowboy hats and boots to seem authentic. Truck commercials still use frontier imagery to sell vehicles to suburban dads who've never herded anything more challenging than their kids into a minivan. We've kept the aesthetic while trying to distance ourselves from the implications, like someone who still wears their ex's hoodie but swears they're totally over them. The cowboy myth tells you something fascinating about how humans create heroes. We don't usually celebrate people as they actually were. We celebrate edited versions, highlight reels, stories that tell us what we want to hear about ourselves. The real cowboys were workers doing a temporary job during a brief period of American history, but we needed them to be more than that. We needed them to represent freedom, independence, moral clarity, and American exceptionalism. So we invented a version that did, and we loved that invention so much that we built it into our national DNA. The myth became more real than reality, more powerful than facts, because the myth served a purpose that truth couldn't. If stories like this hit different for you, if you're the kind of person who wants to understand how we build the legends we live by and what they cost us, then this channel is your place. Subscribe so you never miss when we uncover another piece of the past that popular culture tried to simplify. You belong here. Today, the cowboy rides on, sort of. He's in every Western-themed restaurant, every rodeo, every country song about dirt roads and simple living. He's in political speeches about American values and independence. He's become shorthand for a whole set of ideas about what America is or should be, even though the historical reality contradicts most of those ideas. We fell in love with cowboys because we needed heroes who represented something pure and American at a time when the nation was deeply unsure of itself. We regretted it, or at least some of us did, when we realized that glorifying that myth meant glorifying violence, overlooking exploitation, and simplifying a complex history into a story that was more comfortable than true. The cowboy became America's favorite hero and favorite lie, all wrapped up in leather chaps and a 10-gallon hat. We can't stop loving the image, even now that we know better. And maybe that's the most American thing about the cowboy myth. It's not about truth. It never was. It's about the story we wanted to tell ourselves, the heroes we needed to invent, and the fantasy we chose over reality because reality was just too messy, too complicated, and too uncomfortable to face. The cowboy rides eternal in our imagination, forever young, forever noble, forever free, and forever completely fictional.